Okay, thanks for coming, everyone. Welcome to Individuation and Right Livelihood, Work as a Spiritual Path. My name is Dr. James Newell. I'm the director of the Depth Psychology Academy and the Depth Psychology Alliance, and this is our free introductory seminar on individuation and right livelihood. Now, I know some of you are familiar with the courses that we've offered before through the Depth Psychology Academy and the Depth Psychology Alliance. And if you do that, if you're familiar with that, then you know that we've been doing 8-module college level courses, kind of going intensely into Jungian psychology, starting with the Jung 101, really introductory stuff, and on up to more recent courses that are sort of more focused, fine-tuned, focused on things. And these earlier courses have been very well received and successful, and many of them are still available at www.depthpsychologyacademy.com if you want to look into that. But what we're trying to do now, what we're hoping to do with this seminar series, and with another series coming up in July, which is called The Archetype of Money, is to make this material, this information about depth psychology available to people who want to think about depth psychology and use it in daily life. These seminars are going to be a little shorter, more succinct, probably 45 minutes to 50 minutes, something like that, of course with a discussion afterwards. But they'll be less academic, and the hope is to make depth psychology more accessible and more understandable outside of the immediate depth psychology community. A lot of these courses have been aimed at people who are already licensed in psychology and just want to be able to bring some Jung into it. People are kind of academically oriented, so we want to also make this material available to people who may not feel that comfortable with the academic approach. So people who just want to know more about depth psychology and how it can be applied in life situations, because it really is, I think, a tool that can be so valuable in so many different ways. And today we're going to talk about right livelihood and individuation in the context of right livelihood, or you could say right livelihood in the context of individuation. But individuation isn't specific to that. It's an ongoing process of communicating with the unconscious and keeping that energy flowing, and doing that can be valuable for relationships and for just artistic, creative work, community work, so many different things. So what we're focusing on now will be right livelihood. But if you're not real familiar with Jung, I know some of you are, but for those who are not, the question, of course, comes up, what is individuation? Some people may not be familiar with the term right livelihood. And another question might be, what do those two things have to do with work as a spiritual path? So just in short, we're going to go into more detail in a minute, but in short, individuation is a term coined by Carl Jung, founder of Jungian psychology, and he used the term to describe the process of psychological maturation, as he understood it. And I say we'll go into more detail about that. So next, what is right livelihood? Well, right livelihood is a term used in Buddhism. It's part of the Eightfold Path in Buddhism, which is a part of the Four Noble Truths. And we're not going to get into all of that. There's all kinds of things we could say about right livelihood, but the shorthand definition might be that it's about earning one's living in an ethical way. We all have to support ourselves, and when we try to support ourselves and our families in a way that does not harm ourselves or anyone else, any other beings, trying to do that would be pursuing a path of right livelihood. And as we know, many of us, not everyone, but many of us spend 40 or more hours a week at work, not counting commuting time, whether we're just working for money alone or trying to achieve some further goal. Most of us would like to be able to find some meaning in the work so that the work isn't just kind of lost time. If our values include an emphasis on psychological help and personal development and the pursuit of our spiritual goals, then naturally trying to bring that kind of creative spirituality into the workplace would be a priority for many of us. Unfortunately, for a lot of people, our work lives do not feel congruent with spirituality or with our individuation goals. Many people find it difficult to express their creative spiritual goals in the context of the kind of work that they do day to day, and maybe would like to change that work, or would like to even if they stay in that work, be able to have more congruence between what their inner goals, who they are internally, have that be more in sync with what they're doing every day. Whether we're simply doing that for money or because we want to get another position that we prefer in the same line of work, but something that gives us more freedom, or even if we just want to be able to more creatively express our own personal visions in some kind of an ideal work environment. It can be disappointing, and when it's disappointing, regardless of the work we're doing, it can sometimes bring a certain kind of bitterness and resentfulness into the workplace. And of course, that compounds and compounds, and it just gets more unpleasant. So the purpose of this seminar series is to just look at ways, explore ways from a Jungian perspective. All the work we do with the Depth Psychology Alliance and the Depth Psychology Academy it's not exclusively Jungian at the Depth Psychology Alliance, but it's very much Jungian, and the Academy is pretty much exclusively Jungian. It's trying to, from that perspective, trying to begin to work on how we can heal this split between our spiritual intentions or our personal development intentions and our day-to-day work lives. And additionally, say for example you're happy with your work life and that you do have some congruence there, then the goal becomes maintenance. How do I maintain that day after day in an ongoing way? So there's an integration between my work and my spiritual goals, my individuation goals, and my personal development goals, and just my sense of what I'm doing every day, my sense of where my life is spiritually and intentionally and all that. So just to start out with, I said we'd go back and look at each of these things individually. So to look at individuation, it's the word that Jung used to describe the differentiation of the conscious ego from the unconscious self. And many of you may be familiar with this or a similar diagram to what's on the side here. The ego is the center of consciousness, and there's a personal unconscious for Jung and a collective unconscious, and there's a persona, which is sort of the mask that we wear as we deal with the world outside of us. So Jung goes on to say, quote, "The aim of individuation is nothing less than to divest the self," that's the personality, the identity self, "to divest the self of the false wrappings of the persona on the one hand." And as I said, that's the persona is the mask that we use to face the world, and I'm going to have a lot more to say about the persona as we go along. But it's not always, the persona is not always congruent with our deeper self, who we are. It's how we kind of get by in the world. So Jung says in individuation, we want to divest the self of these false wrappings on the one hand, and divest ourselves of the suggestive power of primordial images on the other, close quote. And what he means by primordial images is archetypes and the numinous archetypal energies that are always just below the surface and that are at the core of the blocks that we have in our psyches. At the core of them is always an archetype, and that archetypal energy being blocked can become problematic. So he wants us in the individuation process, the first phase is to actually develop a persona, but then he says he wants us to divest ourselves of that persona, not have to be always kind of enslaved to a false mask, and also to not be at the mercy of these primordial images or archetypal energies that come up internally, unconsciously. So as I say, the first phase of the individuation process involves the development of an identity within the social group. And in this context, work then is a form of self-care. We do this work to give ourselves an identity and to give ourselves the things we need to be able to act within a social group. Now, our choice of work helps us in our adaptation to the social world. But when we look at this phase as being a phase of adaptation, the first phase is our adaptation to the family. There's the separation from the mother and the adaptation to the family group. Whatever the dynamics of the family group are, we have to somehow fit in there and adapt to that group and find our place in the family. And the next phase then is what I was just describing. We have to find ourselves in the world outside of the family, move beyond the family. And a part of this further adaptation involves learning how to survive, by providing our own food and shelter and transportation and a social reference group, etc. So work then falls into this category, which provides us with income, with identity, and with some independence from that, as he says, the false wrappings of the persona. But it gives us that foothold in the world. And really, to go into the second phase of individuation, it's really necessary to at least have a lot of that first phase work done. If we try to do the second phase work when we don't have a strong ego structure and a strong engagement with the world, a strong ability to function independent of the family and independent of the mother and all that, we'll tend to get overwhelmed by the unconscious. But that's kind of getting ahead of myself here. But the second phase of the individuation process involves further phases of psychological maturation. This requires the development of autonomy, which involves a shift from the social demands of the first phase to concentration on living one's own authentic life. And this is what he means by divesting ourselves of the false wrappings of the persona. We want to find out, who am I authentically? In order to form the persona, certain things don't fit into the persona. I don't want everyone to, if the social group requires me to be in a particular way, then I kind of role play whatever that is that they want me to be, and things that don't fit into that, either through repression or neglect, fall into the unconscious and fall into what Jung calls the shadow, and we'll talk about that in a minute as well. So as one integrates more and more of one's authentic life into one's conscious personality, which is, I'm kind of glossing over it, it's a complicated thing. It means, to some extent, the persona needs to be broken down a little bit in order to make room for these things which had previously been not included in the persona. But in order to integrate more and more of this authentic self and authentic life, we work on blocks and things, as I said earlier, which Jung called complexes. And at the core of these complexes are this numinous blocked archetypal energies. And as we work on those things more and more, those energies become more and more available. And they can, when they become more available, if we have a strong enough personality structure, they can be consciously engaged drivers of one's own creative self-transformation. So these numinous energies are typically released as we work on the unconscious energy blocks. Now, the ultimate goal for Jung and for the individuation process is to maintain a connection between the deep unconscious and our positively grounded, consciously, rationally thinking mind. And this is, part of the first phase, where we have a strong ego structure, personality structure, where we can steward these energies as they come up from the unconscious. If we fail to maintain this connection, we run the risk of either becoming inflated with anxiety or depressed and alienated from our own life energies. We either lose contact with those life energies altogether and feel like we have no energy to engage in the world at all, or we become inflated and have a disproportionate sense of ourselves, or just have an ongoing sense of anxiety that's constantly sort of pressing against us, because these energies are not integrated into what we're doing. When we do maintain this connection with these unconscious energies through dream work and through active imagination, through various ways of dialoguing with the unconscious, staying in touch with the unconscious, we develop, or at least potentially, the goal is to develop a continuous flow of creative energy along what Erich Neumann has called, and Edward Edinger also picked up on this, the ego-self axis. So there's this gradient. You can see this in this diagram on the right. As the ego becomes more and more differentiated from the unconscious, we, instead of becoming completely dissociated from those energies, which is what I was saying, when we become alienated from that state, we keep in touch with the unconscious through some kind of work, dream work, or even just prayer and religious practice of various kinds, spiritual practices, or active imagination is something that Jung recommended. These days, there's so many different ways to do this, but to keep this contact with the natural being of who we are. We can do this through being in nature and so many different ways, but keeping this contact this ego-self axis going is really very, very important. And in this diagram, we show the kind of the whole process where the first phase is separating from the mother, differentiating the ego from the unconscious. This is where it's completely fused in what Jung called participation mystique, or mystical participation with the unconscious. But we differentiate this a little bit more, become a little bit more conscious, a little bit more conscious. And if we can do this and maintain the ego-self axis, that's the goal. So we keep that energy flowing. Now, as I said, when we are developing this persona, certain things don't fit into the persona, and they fall into what Jung called the shadow. And this is both of these diagrams are, well, actually, this diagram is from Edward Edinger's book Ego and Archetype, and this one is from Esther Harding's book The I and the Not I. This is sort of a, and of course, obviously, the psyche doesn't really look like this. These are just symbolic ways of understanding it. But this is the individual psyche. This is the conscious psyche with the ego in the center. And these elements in the unconscious tend to get projected into the outer world. They'll be projected onto persons, things, situations. But the unwanted things that didn't fit into the persona tend to fall into the shadow. And probably 90% of the work that people do in therapy and do with dream work and do with active imagination is teasing out the different complexes that make up the shadow. And as that is done, slowly, slowly freeing up these blocked energies that are caught in the unconscious. So that's like a very thumbnail, quick sketch for those of you who are not familiar with Jung's so what he sometimes calls the anatomy of the psyche. But so the question is now, how does this fit into the idea of right livelihood? I've touched on some of that as we go through this, but the idea of right livelihood coincides, as I was saying earlier, about how work is a form of self-care as we're developing this role in the culture. So in that sense, the idea of right livelihood coincides not only with this first phase of the individuation process, which involves the adaptation to the collective, adaptation to society and the social group, but it can also be deeply connected with our potential to be animated by the numinosity of a rich spiritual life. And that's and remember, when Jung is talking about, if Jung uses the word God, if he uses the word, I don't think he uses the word spiritual much, I'm using it a lot, but numinosity and connecting with the archetypal energies, and there's a sense of the word numinosity is sort of descriptive of a subjective experience of the sacred. But when we're talking about that in a Jungian sense, we're not talking about a particular spiritual path. We're not talking about an objective God, a metaphysical God. We're talking about what's actually going on in the images that are generated by the psyche, the energy, the concrete energy in the central nervous system. I'm going to leave it at that without going too far into it. So I'm not talking about a specific kind of spiritual life. I'm talking about the sense of the spiritual that we get when we're engaging with the archetypal realm of the deep unconscious. So right livelihood can be, and what I'm talking about in this short seminar today and in the remaining series next week and beyond, is about how we can access this numinosity in daily life and this connection to the deep unconscious and to a rich spiritual life by working through these different patterns that emerge from the unconscious. So when this numinous energy of the unconscious rises in the form of dreams and other symbols, the question becomes, how might we steward this energy, be able to regulate and steward this energy in a way that it becomes useful not only to us individually in our work, but then, they say when the cup runneth over, then we're able to use that energy working for the community, people around us, working for our families, working for the world in general, just any kind of creative work that we might do that's generative and serves others. Now, this idea of how this transformation would happen, how this ability to steward this energy might happen, is really beautifully illustrated by a fairy tale that Jung wrote about many years ago. He didn't usually write about fairy tales. Jung left the bulk of fairy tale work to his colleague and student Marie-Louise von Franz. Highly recommend, if you like fairy tales and Jungian readings of fairy tales, she is the past master. Many books on her work in fairy tales. However, he did write one essay on a fairy tale called The Spirit in the Bottle. It's a Grimm's fairy tale. And he gives us in that essay some insight into how one might both adapt to the collective values of the community in which we live, as well as how one might simultaneously work with these numinous energies that arise from the unconscious. So what I'm going to read now is Jung's brief adaptation. He's kind of condensed the Grimm fairy tale, The Spirit in the Bottle. And so Jung says, quote, "Once upon a time there was a poor woodcutter. He had an only son whom he wished to send to a high school. However, since he could give him only a little money to take with him, it was used up long before the time for the examinations. So the son went home and helped his father with the work in the forest. Once, during the midday rest, he roamed the woods and came to an immense old oak. There he heard a voice calling from the ground, 'Let me out! Let me out!' He dug down among the roots of the tree and found a well-sealed glass bottle from which, clearly, the voice had come. He opened it, the glass bottle, and instantly a spirit rushed out and soon became half as high as the tree. The spirit cried in an awful voice, 'I have had my punishment, and I will be revenged. I am the great and mighty spirit Mercurius, and now you shall have your reward. Whoso releases me, him I must strangle.' This made the boy uneasy, as well it might, and quickly thinking up a trick, he said, 'First, I must be sure that you are the same spirit that was shut up in that little bottle.' To prove this, the spirit crept back into the bottle. Then the boy made haste to seal it, and the spirit was caught again. But now the spirit promised to reward the boy richly if the boy would let him out. So the boy let him out and received as a reward a small piece of rag. Quote, the spirit, 'If you spread one end of this over a wound, it will heal, and if you rub steel or iron with the other end, it will turn into silver.' Thereupon the boy rubbed his damaged axe with the rag, and the axe turned to silver, and he was able to sell it for $400. Thus father and son were freed from all worries. The young man could return to his studies, and later, thanks to this rag, the healing rag, he became a famous doctor." Close quote. So that's the sort of Reader's Digest condensed version of this fairy tale. You can look it up in Grimm. There's several different versions of it that you can find. So the appearance now. So we're obviously now with Jung. We do not read these things. We don't read the unconscious. We don't read cultural phenomena. We don't read religions and things like that. We do not read them literally. We read them symbolically. So how would we read this symbolically to fit in with what we're talking about? Well, the appearance of the spirit as an overwhelming presence which towers over the boy is a powerful image of the numinosity of the archetype when it is first encountered and released into one's life. So we're working on things, we're plugging along, and all of a sudden we hit on something that really resonates, and all this energy comes out. Well, in this context, and talking about this same fairy tale, Jungian analyst Murray Stein, in his book Psyche at Work, says, quote, "When Mercurius is freed in a real-life situation, a relationship, a workplace, a family, or elsewhere, we are confronted with a lot of affect," that means a lot of emotion, "with intense pressures to discharge an impulse." In other words, we suddenly want to do something. Something has to be done. Maybe we get angry. Maybe we become emotional, and we're uncomfortable with that. Whatever it is, our self-protective defenses naturally come into play. We try to defend against this energy overwhelming us. We feel like typically when a complex or one of these unconscious constituents of the unconscious becomes activated, if it has more energy than the conscious will, it has the danger of overcoming the conscious will and through impulse getting us to do things that we didn't intend to do, don't want to do, and can cause all kinds of havoc in our lives. So as he says, when this happens and the defense mechanisms come up, this is when we resist. And when these defenses, such as denial, repression, splitting, projection, these defenses are an instinctive attempt to containment. We're trying to contain this energy that suddenly has appeared. In the same way the spirit Mercurius suddenly leapt out of the bottle, these things can intrude themselves into our lives, and our defense mechanisms come out. If these defenses work, Stein says, the situation will cool off and calm down, but unfortunately, the potential benefit will be lost too. And this is, I was saying earlier, we'll either be inflated or will become alienated. And what he's describing here is when you become alienated from the energies. The energy was available for a moment, but it cooled off, and now we've repressed it, and it's gone. And not only have we repressed it and it's gone, and we feel a kind of a flattened affect now, we feel out of touch with our energies, but that unruly spirit, this numinosity, may be driven back into hiding only to reappear again later and perhaps more destructively. Or worse yet, Stein says, to stay away, in which case the fizz goes out and the system becomes lifeless and flat. And that's, close quote, and that's when we become depressed and alienated and just have an inability to really engage in anything and feel that we're talking about the workplace, that the workplace feels meaningless and that we're just wasting our time with all this. So if this numinous spirit is released in a workplace in which one is unhappy, it can appear in the form of projections onto colleagues or customers, and it can generally disrupt one's day-to-day work in, as I say, in negative ways. In the fairy tale, however, the boy manages to get the spirit back into the bottle, and he negotiates terms which benefit both of them. And now this is symbolic of, Jung called this an ethical obligation. We have an ethical obligation to process what comes up from the unconscious in a way that's sort of ethically acceptable to ourselves and to the social group in which we're in. So this negotiation with the unconscious is a vital element of regulating the numinous energies that rise up in us, and it's a vital element in creatively adapting these energies to the ethical requirements of the world around us, and to us being able to use that energy in creative and transformational ways. So by negotiating with the spirit, and this is in the fairy tale is the spirit, but for us it's negotiating with the unconscious, we can make, this is what we do when we do dream work, when we do active imagination, or even if we're just through meditation, mindfulness, and different things. If we get an image that I should shoot my neighbor, hopefully most of us will make the ethical decision that no, that should not be understood concretely, that should be understood symbolically, and then we try to understand the symbols, and we negotiate with the symbols and with the unconscious and try to work it through that way. By doing this, we can maintain our connection to these archetypal energies, to the realm of the spirit and the collective unconscious, and our connection to this enlivening energy can then potentially bring love and joy into the work environment and be able to charge it with meaning rather than this flattened affect that we were describing. As Murray Stein says, quote, without an archetypal connection, work is sheer labor. The archetypal connection transforms labor into meaningful work. So this negotiation with the spirit Mercurius, as the boy kind of made a deal with the spirit that if he promised to give him some boon, some reward, then he'd let him out of the bottle. So this was the negotiation. It's a shorthand for this kind of development, this working on the ego-self axis. His negotiation with the numinous energy of the unconscious resulted in the boy now having ready access to the psychological and material resources he needed to continue his studies and to serve others in the world, as a doctor, as the fairy tale says. So in this sense, his negotiations with the spirit Mercurius are analogous to developing what some Jungians call the ego-self axis. And if we see the boy as the ego and the spirit Mercurius as a manifestation of the archetype of the self, their communication and negotiation represent the energy going back and forth along this gradient of the ego-self axis. So what this does is, if we're able to do all this kind of work and tease open our complexes and our shadow issues where this energy has been blocked, this brings us to the level of vocation. And the Merriam-Webster dictionary says that When vocation was first used in English in the 15th century, it referred specifically to a summons from God to perform a particular task or function in life, especially a religious one. Now, this is significant because for Jung, whenever you see this kind of thing, a religious call from the unconscious, he would identify that as being something archetypal and something from the collective unconscious. He would read it, in other words, symbolically rather than literally. He didn't concretely or literally assume that people actually had a summons from God, but God being a symbol for the archetype of the self, he would say that it was a symbolic calling of one's authentic self that one wants to be able to integrate into their life. And that's, again, this is what vocation is, having this call integrated into what one does in their daily life. So this points to the idea that vocation results from being enlivened by, being in touch with an archetype, and usually specifically the archetype of the self. So the boy in the spirit in the bottle story found his successful vocation because he was connected to the archetypal realm while simultaneously being integrated into the social world in which he lived, which, being a doctor, being able to go to the college and all that, or the high school he was in. So when he was poor and chopping trees in the woods with his father, he was isolated and he was not integrated into society. But once he became connected to the archetypal realm through the spirit Mercurius, he was able to reintegrate because he was able to bring back into society, into the social world, this boon in the same way. If you're familiar with Joseph Campbell and his stories about the hero's journey, the boy in the spirit in the bottle story had completed the hero's journey and returned from the wilderness with something which benefited himself as well as others. So now this, when we look at the idea of right livelihood in the Buddhist context, or similar ethical ideas in other traditions, the emphasis is primarily then on seeking out a kind of work that would not interfere with one's commitments to an ethical path, in other words, with one's commitments to the social world. And this is a part more of the first phase of individuation because it involves it's a top-down way of understanding adaptation. One is adapting to an edict, a precept that has been given by the social group. And it's not to say it's a bad thing, and very good things can result from that, but it's a starting place. It's not enlivened by a calling coming up from the unconscious. When we speak of vocation in the sense illuminated by the story of the spirit in the bottle, we're speaking of numinous energy rising up from the unconscious in the form of a calling. In the hero's journey, we hear that the hero is called. It's a call to adventure, and in this case, it's a call to a particular way of being in the world and a particular way of working in the world. So this call may then be stewarded in a way that meets the ethical requirements of the social group. So we're not abandoning the ethical, the idea of right livelihood, or there are many other different ethical ways to understand work that's informed by a spiritual sense. But it's not abandoning that. It's adapting the call, the inner call, who one authentically is, to an ethical way of behaving in the world that serves others and that people can respond to in a positive way. Now, another aspect of right livelihood involves congruence between one's unconscious nature and the work that one chooses. And it's the same thing, but it's not using the Jungian language on it. Excuse me. So according to author Marcia Sinitar, she says, a recent national poll revealed that 95% of America's working population do not enjoy the work they do. And this was actually about, I think, 30 years ago that she was writing this, but I'm sure it's very much still true. She says this is a profoundly tragic statistic, considering that work consumes so much time in our lives. In a few brief decades, our working life adds up to really life itself. Such a nose to the grindstone attitude is not even a good formula for success, because when you study people who are successful, as she says, I have over the years, it's abundantly clear that their achievements are directly related to the enjoyment they derive from their work. They enjoy it in large part because they are good at it, close quote. So the individuation process requires that there be a regular flow of archetypal numinous energy along a gradient of the ego-self axis. If there's no congruence between one's nature, one's natural personality and personality type, and the work that one does, this flow will at best be interrupted, and at worst, it will cut us off from any sense of the joy of life and of living. And without that flow, no genuine self-expression or spiritual creativity is possible. And one of the things that's really essential about just understanding the Jungian process is that the whole process of individuation doesn't necessarily lead to right livelihood, but it leads to it's essential that there be some sort of creative self-expression, because if the work is done in a way, we've got this archetypal energy flowing all the time, and it's either going to lead us to inflation, or it's going to lead us to alienation if we're completely cut off from it. But even if we're cut off, that doesn't mean that the energy isn't flowing. So once we can get a handle on it and conduct this negotiation, as the boy did with the spirit in the bottle, and we can get some kind of a flow of this energy, there's lots and lots of energy going to come out. So what happens to that energy? The energy has to be spent. And ultimately, for Jung, it was always to be spent creatively. The proper use of the energy for him, he felt when he started doing his work with the Red Book, which is where he developed his technique of active imagination and all of that, he eventually ceased the work with the Red Book and built this huge tower in Bollingen and created this huge, by now they're still publishing work from Jung's seminars and from unpublished works of his, just volume after volume after volume, because he just had all of this creative energy was suddenly let loose by this inner work that he was doing. So he had this energy flowing, but he had a conduit, a way to regulate it in creative ways, through his writing, through his teaching, through his artistic work in the Red Book, and then later in the Bollingen Tower. If you're familiar with this huge work that he made out of stone, this huge building where he would live and go on retreat. So all of this is sort of the aim of Jungian work is not that you go in and you see a doctor for a week or two or three, and then you're cured and then you go off. It's an ongoing process of regulating this creative energy and moving this creative energy ultimately and hopefully in a way that's generative for, again, one's family, one's community, and the world at large. That's the aim and the goal of Jungian work, is not to be cured and then you go off and do something else. It's to contribute to this ongoing creative transformation. So when we experience that regular flow, that ability to regulate the numinous energy of the deep unconscious and use it in a way that enlivens our lives and the lives of others, work can be experienced as play. When we encounter someone who's really successful at what they do, we often find that they became successful because they do it so much. And why do they do it so much? Because they love it. They would do it even if they weren't being paid for it. And you find most very, very successful people, you find that they, for many years, either did it without being paid for it or did it not being paid very much just because they loved to do it. Maybe they had a tiresome job waiting tables or doing something else during the day, but then at night they'd throw themselves into this work that really gave them all this energy. And they did it so much that they loved it, and because for them it was play, and by doing it so often and so much and with so much joy, they became very, very accomplished at this activity, whatever it was. They became very, very good at it. And because they became good at it and they kept doing it with love and enthusiasm, they put all that into the work. It resulted in the development of a skill that was also enlivening to others. In other words, that energy that they put into it then is, of course, attractive to everyone. And, suddenly they're an overnight success, but it's because and so many people, when they reach a place like that, they don't quit their job and go off to the Mediterranean or something. They keep doing it because they just love doing it. It's such a joy. So, as we were discussing earlier, the purpose of the seminar series that begins next week is to look at ways, from a Jungian perspective, that we might begin to work on healing this split between what our spiritual intentions and our self-development goals and our individuation goals are, what that on one side, and what our actual day-to-day work lives look like. What if there's a split? As I say, if there's not a split, then how can we maintain it? But if there is a split, this is we're going to look at step-by-step ways of doing that. And as I say, in addition, once we've begun to heal the split, the question becomes how do we maintain this integration of work and spiritual goals. So that's what's going to be happening over the next 4 weeks, next week and 3 weeks after that. It's something new. As I said, we haven't done this before. We've been doing more sort of in-depth classes. These are going to be more kind of workshop, seminar things with discussions and things that people can kind of put into practice. But for me, the way I've set up this series, a Jungian perspective on how one might accomplish this goal of bridging this gap and keeping it, maintaining the flow of this energy, is laid out in the 4 modules that we're going to be looking at. So the first seminar will be identifying the vision. What would, in other words, for each of us trying to find out what would a spiritual work life look like for me? What would be the ideal outcome? The second seminar would be identifying the blocks. What's keeping me from reaching this? What's keeping me from either seeing my vision of what that might be, and what is if I know what it is, then what's keeping me from fulfilling that and getting through that? And from a Jungian perspective, those blocks, when they're unconscious blocks, there may be actual worldly blocks of various kinds that, concrete, real things in the outer world, but also there are going to be things in the unconscious, and those we tend to call complexes. So we'll talk about, in Seminar 3, we'll talk about the complexes and preparing for change and engaging with those blocks. How do we tease out those blocks? How do we slowly, step by step, begin to work on these things in ways that are practical and logical and not too threatening to someone who's kind of just trying to step by step make these changes. And then the fourth seminar is going to be about instituting the change, really plowing in there, entering into creative flow. What would that look like? What does it look like? And how do we maintain this kind of creative, transformative flow over long periods, over continuing periods of time, in any case. So I hope if you find any of these ideas interesting, that you'll go ahead and visit www.depthpsychologyacademy.com and register for the seminar that begins next week. In the meantime, what I want to do for the rest of our time today is to discuss how we can make some small steps towards approaching work as a spiritual path, and also just any, if you want to go back over anything I've said today, if you have questions about that or contributions, but just to kind of to think about things to think about in regard to this. Some first steps might involve just knowing oneself. Who am I at the core of my personality? What is it in me that is not being expressed in my persona, which is not being expressed in my daily work life? What would I like to integrate more into my daily work life that's not currently there, being expressed in that life? Another thing is identifying a focused direction. If I know who I am, then in what's the direction I want to point in order to fulfill that more? How can I best express who I am at the core of my personality? And then finally, what kind of strategies can we use to initiate small, positive, logical steps towards this new direction? What small first steps could we take towards that direction? So that is what I'd like to think about, and I'd like to open it up and see if anybody has any thoughts or questions or want to share anything. I want to thank you all for coming and for listening to all that. I hope it made some sense, and I hope it sparked some ideas. Anybody have a thought? And if you're too shy to speak up and unmute yourself, if you would like to put a question or a thought or a contribution in the chat, we can do that.
Not really a question, it's just to say that was a tremendous amount of information, which I'm I'm still absorbing it all. It was I am familiar with some of it, but I'm just processing it. And I suppose what strikes me most is this finding that connection that I presume the course is going to help us. Oh, I disappeared. No, I'm back.
No,
Yeah.
someone asked me to show the last page again, so I just brought that back up.
Oh, okay. Yes.
But
Yeah.
sure. Well, yeah, that's the idea, and the idea isn't that. In other words, I can't present the direction for anybody. That's the whole point will be for try to come up with ways for each of us that we can find what it is for ourselves, because it's the individuation is in the name itself is the idea of developing the individual, and so it's going to be a different thing for each person, and probably a different approach, but there are certain patterns that we're all going to follow.
Mhm. Um, After about 30 years of working in a field that has been rewarding for me, that I've loved, um, and through which I have tolerated some wearying aspects, which people may identify with, um, I'm old enough that I only want the good parts, um, or I want to make peace with my work in a new way.
So, what are the good
And
parts for you?
the good parts are when I'm a family physician and homeopath. The good parts are when the patient and I appear to me to be in tune, and they're asking for something that I can give and that can be given to them, and they're giving on in their part. They are meeting me with that, um, and
What's the other?
well, to put it in a raw form, I had a mentor who said clearly, "You are not a vending machine." So if somebody clearly comes to me wanting to treat me as a vending machine with something that's just, I'm not going to do, it's very easy. But sometimes I'm having a hard time awakening something in this interaction that helps them find what they need to do.
Hmm. Right. Well, yeah. So people want uh, something done for them. They don't think that they should have to take part in the healing process. They want you to just give them meds or give them some sort of easy answer.
Perhaps, or they want to recycle something that they know hasn't worked.
They
Yeah.
want say more about that. They want to recycle something they know doesn't work.
Um, yeah, they want me to help them find another person who can give them something that they can't, that they really should be doing for themselves.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So so that sounds like is that do you have control over who you see and who you don't see?
That I can,
Uh,
and finding the best way to work with each person because they respond differently.
sure.
Um, it is it's a challenge that I like. You know, that's engaging for me. And I'm not taking any new patients now because I don't want to deal with new new ways of working with this. I have enough to do working with the people that I have. So yeah, I can decide, and I can say no, we really can't go much further with this unless, and I can set some boundaries.
Hmm. And what about bringing bringing some of this real positive energy into the encounters that you do? In other words, I mean, I know you, and I know you have a spiritual life. So, what about bringing some of that into it? Is that possible? Is that something you can do?
I do move that way, and sometimes I get some what I think are some results. but I'm wondering what else I need to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking that one thing I need to do is stop billing their insurance and start charging them.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, that's getting beyond my area of expertise, but I can see why that would be important. Well, thanks, Corinne. Anything you'd like me to contribute to that, or
Mm,
I mean, do you have a question, or
I think it's a process. I'm just saying,
yeah?
this is where I am in the process,
Mm-hmm.
and I took a lot of notes. You know, I've got some things I want to imagine with here.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
So, someone, Anne-Marie said, is there a template that will be used to guide the process? Uh, I mean, I hadn't thought about providing an actual template, but I mean, the kind of sort of what I laid out of the four modules, the four seminars themselves are kind of a template. But yeah, I can certainly do that. I've been thinking about. I haven't prepared everything, all the materials yet of what we're going to have, but that. I mean, I'm glad you asked that. Is something that the idea of a template is a little bit problematic with Jungian stuff because everybody is so individual. But there are templates that can be used at least just for a guideline. The thing with Jung is that he would say that he always you say I don't have a method and I let things happen as they come, but he was always aware of the patterns of the unconscious, and there are certain patterns um, that we might not immediately fit into, but there's the process. There's always a process, and there is a process which it varies depending on where someone is in the process, but there's a certain outline. I mean, I kind of really rapidly went through that whole process today, and we'll slow it down and go into more detail in the seminar. So, but I will, and Anne Marie, if you remind me of that again, I will. I can certainly provide a kind of template that would have to be very flexible for each person using it differently. And I see you have your hand up. Did you want to ask a question?
I do. I just want to thank you for that. And also, so do you anticipate that it will be in the format of sharing these patterns, these Jungian patterns that you just discussed, and then the rest of it will be discussion amongst the members in the
participants,
seminar, so that we're learning from each other?
Yeah, the idea is to present I'm hoping, as I say, this is more experimental. In the past, I've done more kind of lecture, college level type things, and this is more workshop oriented. So my hope is to, do it, have 40, 45 minutes, 50 minutes of presenting ideas, and I'll have some on the online. I'll have some PDFs and things that people can further study and use just to kind of as workbook kind of things. And then we can talk about it together and just see, where hopefully everybody will have a different, be in a different place and be focusing on different phases, and we can all kind of see the different potentials of the whole process. I mean, when you talk about individuation and Jungian work, as I say, it's not a quick thing. Jungian work tends to be something that we just integrate what we're already doing. If someone's interested in Jung, they usually have a little bit of intuition to begin with, at least, if not a lot, and they have some kind of a spiritual sense or a sense of there being something more than just the cognitive top-down approach. And so it'll be looking at it that way, and that's always going to have to be at least a little bit there's a framework, but a lot of it has to come in the moment and where a person is and in the process, and it's a long ongoing thing. And the hope for this is to provide people with the framework that they can then apply on and on. That's the goal. Sure. Thank you for asking.
I'm sorry to take up so much time, but I just have one
more
more
take all the
question.
time you want.
I understand, and I'm falling in this category of everyone is at a different place, a different level. I'm just curious as to how many people are not working and are looking for that occupation or that work that would inherently have that spiritual element to it, and wondering if there's anyone else who's in that place, which is kind of where I am.
Yeah, so you're asking the group today.
Correct.
So I see Angela lifting a finger. There are a lot of people are not, I can't see everybody, but oops. Yeah, if anybody wants to respond to Anne Marie, please do. In any case, thanks to Anne Marie. Yeah, any other thoughts or reflections on that or something else? Got something coming up in the chat here. Wait a minute. Well, I'd encourage discussion or thoughts. If not, I appreciate everybody coming. Any other thoughts, please let me know. Otherwise, we'll say thank you. I hope to see you in a future class. There's lots of classes. Oops, I got another chat message. You're welcome. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming. I appreciate it. Hope it was helpful for you, and hope to see you sometime on the Depth Psychology Alliance or the Depth Psychology Academy. And I'm going to sign off. Thank you. Take care.